is easily mistaken for varied practice. It's like the old LP records that could only play their songs in the same sequence. In blocked practice, which is commonly found in sports, a drill is run over and over. The player moves from one station to the next, performing a different maneuver at each station. That's how the LA Kings were practicing their one-touch pass. Make it stick. 66. Before they got religion and started changing it up. It would be like always practicing flashcards in the same order. You need to shuffle your flashcards. If you always practice the same skill in the same way, from the same place on the ice or field, in the same set of math problems, or during the same sequence in a flight simulator, you're starving your learning on short rations of variety. Spacing, interleaving, and variability are natural features of how we conduct our lives. Every patient visit or football game is a test and an exercise in retrieval practice. Every routine traffic stop is a test for a cop. And every traffic stop is different, adding to a cop's explicit and implicit memory and, if she pays attention, making her more effective in the future. The common term is learning from experience. Some people never seem to learn. One difference, perhaps, between those who do and don't is whether they have cultivated the habit of reflection. Reflection is a form of retrieval practice, enhanced with elaboration. As Doug Larson reminds us, the connections between the neurons in the brain are very plastic. Making the brain work is actually what seems to make a difference, bringing in more complex networks, then using those circuits repeatedly, which makes them more robust. When Mia Blundetto, age 23, First Lieutenant, U.S. Marine Corps, was billeted to logistics in Okinawa, she had to get her ticket punched at jump school. Describing that moment 2 years later, she said, "I hate falling, that feeling in your chest. There's not a day in my life I wanted to jump out of an airplane. I wouldn't even go down a water slide until I was in middle school. But I was in charge of a platoon of Marines who rigged parachutes and jumped out of airplanes and dropped cargo. It's one of the most sought-out billets as a logistics officer, very hard to get. My commanding officer said, you know, you will be air delivery platoon commander. If you don't want to do that, I'll put you somewhere else and we'll let the next guy have that job. There's no way I could let somebody else have this job that everybody wanted. So I looked him straight in the face and said, yes, sir, I'll jump out of planes." 4. Embrace difficulties. Make it stick. 68. Mia is 5 feet 7 inches of blonde ambition. Her father, Frank, ex-Marine, is in awe. She'll do more pull-ups than most of the guys in her class. She has the Maryland state record in the bench press. She was 6th in the NCAA for powerlifting. Very soft-spoken, you just don't see it coming. When we had Mia to ourselves, we asked her if Frank was blowing smoke. She laughed. He likes to exaggerate. But when pressed, she admitted to the facts. Until recently, women in the Marines were required to do flex-arm hangs instead of pull-ups, but the newly toughened rules effective in 2014 require a minimum of 3 pull-ups, the same as the minimum for men. Targets are 8 pull-ups for women, 20 for men. Mia does 13 and is shooting for 20. As a student at the Naval Academy, she qualified 2 years in a row for nationals in powerlifting, 3 sets each of bench press, squats, and deadlifts, setting Maryland state records. So we know she's tough. An aversion to falling is an instinctual reflex for self-preservation, but her decision to take the assignment was a foregone conclusion, the kind of grit the Marines and the Blundettos are known for. Mia has a sister and 2 brothers. They're all active-duty Marines. As it turned out, the 3rd time Mia threw herself out the jump door of a C-130 troop transport at 1,250 feet, she plummeted right onto another soldier's inflated parachute. But we're getting ahead of the story. We're interested in her jump school training because it's a great example of how some difficulties that elicit more effort, and that slow down learning, spacing, interleaving, mixing up practice, and others, will more than compensate for their inconvenience by making the learning stronger, more precise, and more enduring. Short-term impediments that make for stronger learning have come to be called desirable difficulties. Embrace difficulties. 69. A term coined by the psychologists Elizabeth and Robert Bjork. Point 2. The Army's jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, is designed to make sure you get it right and get it done, and it's a model of learning through desirable difficulty. You are not allowed to carry a notebook and write notes. You listen, watch, rehearse, and execute. Jump school is a place where testing is the principal instructional medium, and the test is in the doing. And, like all things military, jump school adheres to a strict protocol. Get it right or get the boot. The parachute landing fall, or PLF in military parlance, is a technique of hitting the ground and rolling in a way that distributes the impact over the balls of your feet, the side of your calf, the side of your thigh, the side of your hip, and the side of your back. There are 6 possible directions in which to execute the fall along the length of your body, determined by conditions in the moment such as the direction of your drift, the terrain, wind, and whether you're oscillating as you approach the ground. In your first exposure to this essential skill of parachuting, you stand in a gravel pit where the PLF is explained and demonstrated. Then you try it, you practice falling along different planes of the body, you get corrective feedback, and you practice it again. Over the ensuing week, the difficulty is notched up. You stand on a platform 2 feet off the ground. On the command ready, you rock up on the balls of your feet, and knees together, arms skyward. On the command land, you jump off the wall and execute your PLF. The test becomes more difficult. You clip yourself onto a zipline a dozen feet off the ground, grab onto an overhead T-bar, and drift down to a landing site, where, on command, make it stick. 70. You release and execute the PLF. You practice falling to the right and left, forward and backward, mixing it up, the difficulty is increased again. You climb to a platform 12 feet off the ground, where you practice strapping on your harness, checking gear using the buddy system, and jumping through a mock-up of an airplane jump door. The harness has risers like those from a parachute, hooked to a zipline but allowing for the same long arc of suspension, and when you jump, you have the momentary downward sensation of free fall, followed by the broad oscillations of suspension as you move along the cable. Getting familiar with the motions of a real jump. But at the bottom it's the instructor, not you, who pulls the release and drops you the last 2 or 3 feet to earth. So now you're executing your fall randomly, from all directions, simulating what's to come. Next, you climb a 34-foot tower to practice all the elements of a jump and the choreography of a mass exit from the aircraft, learning how it feels to fall from a height, how to deal with equipment malfunctions, how to jump with a load of heavy combat equipment. Through demonstration and simulation, in escalating levels of difficulty that must be mastered in order to progress from one to the next, you learn how to board the aircraft as a part of a jump crew and participate in the command sequence of 30 troops positioning for a mass exit over a drop zone. How to get out the jump door correctly, how to count 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 and feel your chute deploy, or if you get to 6,000, to pull the cord on your reserve chute, how to deal with twisted suspension lines, avoid collisions, hold into the wind. Sort out a tangled control line, how to avoid stealing air from another jumper, the contingencies for landing in trees, water, or power. Embrace difficulties. 71. Lines, how to jump by day or night, in different wind and weather. The knowledge and skills to be acquired are many, and practice is spaced and interleaved, both by default, as you wait your turn at each of the staging areas, airplane mock-ups, jump platforms, and harness mechanisms, and by necessity. In order to cover all that must be mastered and integrate the disparate components. Finally, if you make it to week 3 without washing out, you jump for real, making 5 exits from a military transport. With successful completion of the training and 5 successful jumps, you earn your jump wings and airborne certificate. On Mia's 3rd jump, she was first in line at the port jump door with 14 jumpers queued behind her, and another 14 queued behind the guy standing at the opposite door. So what the first person does, in this case me, you hand off your static line to the sergeant airborne, and there's a light and it's red or green, and you get the 1-minute warning, then the 30-second warning. I'm standing at this door for a few minutes and it's beautiful. It's probably one of the prettiest things I've ever seen, but I was terrified. There was nothing to get in my way, nothing I had to think about except just waiting for the go. The guy at the other door went, then I jumped, and I'm counting 1,000, 2,000, and suddenly, at 4,000, I had a green parachute wrapped all around me. I'm thinking, there's no way this can be my parachute. I'd felt my chute open, I'd felt that lift. I realized that I was on top of the first jumper, so I just sort of swam out of his parachute and steered away from him. Jumpers are staggered, but in the 4 turbulent seconds until your chute opens you have neither awareness nor control over your proximity to other jumpers. The incident, which make it stick. 72. Amounted to nothing, thanks to her training, is telling nonetheless. Had it frightened her? Not at all, she said. Mia was prepared to handle it, and her confidence gave her the cool to just sort of swim out. It's one thing to feel confident of your knowledge, it's something else to demonstrate mastery. Testing is not only a powerful learning strategy, it is a potent reality check on the accuracy of your own judgment of what you know how to do. When confidence is based on repeated performance, demonstrated through testing that simulates real-world conditions, you can lean into it. Facing the jump door may always reawaken feelings of terror, but the moment she's out, Mia says, the fear evaporates. How learning occurs. To help you understand how difficulty can be desirable, we'll briefly describe here how learning occurs. In coding. Let's imagine you're Mia, standing in a gravel pit watching a jump instructor explain and demonstrate the parachute landing fall. The brain converts your perceptions into chemical and electrical changes that form a mental representation of the patterns you've observed. This process of converting sensory perceptions into meaningful representations in the brain is still not perfectly understood. We call the process encoding, and we call the new representations within the brain memory traces. Think of notes jotted or sketched on a scratch pad, our short-term memory. Much of how we run our day-to-day lives is guided by the ephemera that clutter our short-term memory and are, fortunately, soon forgotten. How to jigger the broken latch on the embrace difficulties. 73. Locker you used when you suited up at the gym today, remembering to stop for an oil change after your workout. But the experiences and learning that we want to salt away for the future must be made stronger and more durable. In Mia's case, the distinctive moves that will enable her to hit the ground without breaking an ankle, or worse. Consolidation. The process of strengthening these mental representations for long-term memory is called consolidation. New learning is labile, its meaning is not fully formed and therefore is easily altered. In consolidation, the brain reorganizes and stabilizes the memory traces. This may occur over several hours or longer and involves deep processing of the new material, during which scientists believe that the brain replays or rehearses the learning, giving it meaning, filling in blank spots, and making connections to past experiences and to other knowledge already stored in long-term memory. Prior knowledge is a prerequisite for making sense of new learning, and forming those connections is an important task of consolidation. Mia's considerable athletic skills, physical self-awareness, and prior experience represent a large body of knowledge to which the elements of a successful PLF would find many connections. As we've noted, sleep seems to help memory consolidation, but in any case, consolidation and transition of learning to long-term storage occurs over a period of time. An apt analogy for how the brain consolidates new learning may be the experience of composing an essay. The first draft is rangy, imprecise. You discover what you want to say by trying to write it. After a couple of revisions you have sharpened the piece and cut away some of the extraneous points. You put it aside to let it ferment. When you pick it up again, make it stick. 74. A day or two later, what you want to say has become clearer in your mind. Perhaps you now perceive that there are 3 main points you are making. You connect them to examples and supporting information familiar to your audience. You rearrange and draw together the elements of your argument to make it more effective and elegant. Similarly, the process of learning something often starts out feeling disorganized and unwieldy. The most important aspects are not always salient. Consolidation helps organize and solidify learning, and, notably, so does retrieval after a lapse of some time, because the act of retrieving a memory from long-term storage can both strengthen the memory traces and at the same time, make them modifiable again, enabling them, for example, to connect to more recent learning. This process is called reconsolidation. This is how retrieval practice modifies and strengthens learning. Suppose that on day 2 of jump school, you're put on the spot to execute your parachute landing fall and you struggle to recall the correct posture and compose yourself. Feet and knees together, knees slightly bent, eyes on the horizon, but in the reflex to break your fall you throw your arm out, forgetting to pull your elbows tight to your sides. You could have broken the arm or dislocated your shoulder if this were the real deal. This effort to reconstruct what you learned the day before is ragged, but in making it, critical elements of the maneuver come clearer and are reconsolidated for stronger memory. If you're practicing something over and over in rapid-fire fashion, whether it's your parachute landing fall or the conjugation of foreign verbs, you're leaning on short-term memory, and very little mental effort is required. You show gratifying improvement rather quickly, but you haven't done much to strengthen the underlying representation of those skills. Your performance in the moment is not an indication of durable. Embrace difficulties. 75. Learning. On the other hand, when you let the memory recede a little, for example by spacing or interleaving the practice, retrieval is harder, your performance is less accomplished, and you feel let down, but your learning is deeper and you will retrieve it more easily in the future. Retrieval. Learning, remembering, and forgetting work together in interesting ways. Durable, robust learning requires that we do 2 things. First, as we recode and consolidate new material from short-term memory into long-term memory, we must anchor it there securely. Second, we must associate the material with a diverse set of cues that will make us adept at recalling the knowledge later. Having effective retrieval cues is an aspect of learning that often goes overlooked. The task is more than committing knowledge to memory. Being able to retrieve it when we need it is just as important. The reason we don't remember how to tie knots even after we've been taught is because we don't practice and apply what we've learned. Say you're in the city park one day and come across an Eagle Scout teaching knots. On a whim you take an hour's lesson. He demonstrates 8 or 10 specimens, explains what each is useful for, has you practice tying them, and sends you away with a short length of rope and a cheat sheet. You head home committed to learning these knots, but life is full, and you fail to practice them. They are soon forgotten, and this story could end there, with no learning. But then, as it happens, the following spring you buy a small fishing boat, and you want to attach an anchor on a line. With rope in hand and feeling mildly stumped, you recall from your lesson that there was a knot for putting a loop in the end of a line. You are now practicing retrieval. You find your cheat. Make it stick. 76. Sheet and relearn how to tie a bowline. You put a small loop in the rope and then take the short end and draw it through, silently reciting the little memory device you were given. The rabbit comes up from his hole, goes around the tree, and goes back down. Retrieval again. A little snugging up, and there you have your knot, a dandy piece of scout craft of the kind you'd always fancied knowing. Later, you put a piece of rope beside the chair where you watch TV and practice the bowline during commercials. You are doing spaced practice. Over the coming weeks you're surprised at how many little jobs are easier if you have a piece of rope with a loop in the end. More spaced practice. By August you have discovered every possible use and purpose in your life for the bowline knot, knowledge, skills, and experiences that are vivid and hold significance, and those that are periodically practiced, stay with us. If you know you're soon to throw yourself out of a troop transport, you listen up good when they're telling you when and how to pull the ripcord on your reserve chute, or what can go wrong at 1,200 feet and how to just sort of swim out of it. The mental rehearsal you conduct while lying in your bunk too tired to sleep and wishing the next day was already over and well jumped, is a form of spaced practice, and that helps you, too. Extending learning, updating retrieval cues. There's virtually no limit to how much learning we can remember as long as we relate it to what we already know. In fact, because new learning depends on prior learning, the more we learn, the more possible connections we create for further learning. Our retrieval capacity, though, is severely limited. Most of what we've learned is not accessible to us at any given moment. This limitation on retrieval is helpful to us, if every. Embrace difficulties. 77. memory were always readily to hand, you would have a hard time sorting through the sheer volume of material to put your finger on the knowledge you need at the moment. Where did I put my hat? How do I sync my electronic devices? What goes into a perfect brandy Manhattan? Knowledge is more durable if it's deeply entrenched, meaning that you have firmly and thoroughly comprehended a concept. It has practical importance or keen emotional weight in your life, and it is connected with other knowledge that you hold in memory. How readily you can recall knowledge from your internal archives is determined by context, by recent use, and by the number and vividness of cues that you have linked to the knowledge and can call on to help bring it forth. Here's the tricky part.
As you go through life, you often need to forget cues associated with older, competing memories so as to associate them successfully with new ones. To learn Italian in middle age, you may have to forget your high school French, because every time you think to be and hope to come up with the Italian esser, a pop setter, despite your most earnest intentions. Traveling in England, you have to suppress your cues to drive on the right side of the road so you can establish reliable cues to stay on the left. Knowledge that is well entrenched, like real fluency in French or years of experience driving on the right side of the road, is easily relearned later, after a period of disuse or after being interrupted by competition for retrieval cues. It's not the knowledge itself that has been forgotten, but the cues that enable you to find and retrieve it. The cues for the new learning, driving on the left, displace those for the old, driving on the right. The paradox is that some forgetting is often essential for new learning. When you change from a PC to a Mac, or from one Windows platform to another, you have to do enormous. Make it stick. 78. Forgetting in order to learn the architecture of the new system and become adept at manipulating it so readily that your attention can focus on doing your work and not on working the machine. Jump school training provides another example. After their military service, many paratroopers take an interest in smoke jumping. Smoke jumpers use different airplanes, different equipment, and different jump protocols. Having trained at the Army's jump school is cited as a distinct disadvantage for smoke jumping, because you have to unlearn one set of procedures that you have practiced to the point of rivalex and replace them with another. Even in cases where both bodies of learning seem so similar to the uninitiated, jumping out of an airplane with a parachute on your back, you may have to forget the cues to a complex body of learning that you possess if you are to acquire a new one. We know this problem of reassigning cues to memory from our own lives, even on the simplest levels. When our friend Jack first takes up with Joan, we sometimes call the couple Jack and Jill, as the cue Jack and pulls up the old nursery rhyme that's so thoroughly embedded in memory. About the time we have Jack and reliably cueing Joan, alas, Joan throws him over, and he takes up with Jenny. Good grief. Half of the time that we mean to say Jack and Jenny we catch ourselves saying Jack and Joan. It would have been easier had Jack picked up with Katie, so that the trailing K sound in his name handed us off to the initiating K in hers, but no such luck. Alliteration can be a handy cue, or a subversive one. In all of this turmoil you don't forget Jill, Joan, or Jenny, but you repurpose your cues so that you can keep pace with the changing opera of Jack's life. It is a critical point that as you learn new things, you don't lose from long-term memory most of what you have learned well in life. Rather, through disuse or the reassignment of cues. Embrace difficulties. 79. You forget it in the sense that you're unable to call it up easily. For example, if you've moved several times, you may not be able to recall a previous address from 20 years ago. But if you are given a multiple-choice test for the address, you can probably pick it out easily, for it still abides, as it were, in the unclean closet of your mind. If you have ever immersed yourself in writing stories of your past, picturing the people and places of earlier days, you may have been surprised by the memories that started Florida-ooting back, things long forgotten now coming to mind. Context can unleash memories, as when the right key works to open an old lock. In Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, The narrator grieves over his inability to recall the days of his adolescence in the French village of his aunt and uncle, until one day the taste of a cake dipped in lime blossom tea brings it all rushing back. All the people and events he thought had long since been lost to time. Most people have experiences like Proust's when a sight or sound or smell brings back a memory in full force, even some episode you have not thought about in years. Easier isn't better. Psychologists have uncovered a curious inverse relationship between the ease of retrieval practice and the power of that practice to entrench learning. The easier knowledge or a skill is for you to retrieve, the less your retrieval practice will benefit your retention of it. Conversely, the more effort you have to expend to retrieve knowledge or skill, the more the practice of retrieval will entrench it. Not long ago, the California Polytechnic State University baseball team, in San Luis Obispo, became involved in an interesting experiment in improving their batting skills. They were all highly experienced players, adept at making solid contact. Make it stick. 80. With the ball, but they agreed to take extra batting practice twice a week, following 2 different practice regimens, to see which type of practice produced better results. Hitting a baseball is one of the hardest skills in sports. It takes less than half a second for a ball to reach home plate. In this instant, the batter must execute a complex combination of perceptual, cognitive, and motor skills, determining the type of pitch, anticipating how the ball will move, and aiming and timing the swing to arrive at the same place and moment as the ball. This chain of perceptions and responses must be so deeply entrenched as to become automatic, because the ball is in the catcher's mitt long before you can even begin to think your way through how to connect with it. Part of the Cal Poly team practiced in the standard way. They practiced hitting 45 pitches, evenly divided into 3 sets. Each set consisted of one type of pitch thrown 15 times. For example, the first set would be 15 fastballs, the second set 15 curveballs, and the third set 15 change-ups. This was a form of mass practice. For each set of 15 pitches, as the batter saw more of that type, he got gratifyingly better at anticipating the balls, timing his swings, and connecting. Learning seemed easy. The rest of the team were given a more difficult practice regimen. The 3 types of pitches were randomly interspersed across the block of 45 throws. For each pitch, the batter had no idea which type to expect. At the end of the 45 swings, he was still struggling somewhat to connect with the ball. These players didn't seem to be developing the proficiency their teammates were showing. The interleaving and spacing of different pitches made learning more arduous and feel slower. The extra practice sessions continued twice weekly for 6 weeks. At the end, when the player's hitting was assessed, the embrace difficulties. 81. 2 groups had clearly benefited differently from the extra practice, and not in the way the players expected. Those who had practiced on the randomly interspersed pitches now displayed markedly better hitting relative to those who had practiced on one type of pitch thrown over and over. These results are all the more interesting when you consider that these players were already skilled hitters prior to the extra training. Bringing their performance to an even higher level is good evidence of a training regimen's effectiveness. Here again we see the 2 familiar lessons. First, that some difficulties that require more effort and slow down apparent gains, like spacing, interleaving, and mixing up practice, will feel less productive at the time, but will more than compensate for that by making the learning stronger, precise, and enduring. Second, that our judgments of what learning strategies work best for us are often mistaken, colored by illusions of mastery. When the baseball players at Cal Poly practiced curveball after curveball over 15 pitches, it became easier for them to remember the perceptions and responses they needed for that type of pitch, the look of the ball's spin, how the ball changed direction, how fast its direction changed, and how long to wait for it to curve. Performance improved, but the growing ease of recalling these perceptions and responses led to little durable learning. It is one skill to hit a curveball when you know a curveball will be thrown. It is a different skill to hit a curveball when you don't know it's coming. Baseball players need to build the latter skill, but they often practice the former, which, being a form of massed practice, builds performance gains on short-term memory. It was more challenging for the Cal Poly batters to retrieve the necessary skills when practice involved random pitches. Meeting that challenge made the performance gains painfully slow but also long-lasting. Make it stick. 82. This paradox is at the heart of the concept of desirable difficulties in learning. The more effort required to retrieve something, the better you learn it. In other words, the more you've forgotten about a topic, the more effective relearning will be in shaping your permanent knowledge. How effort helps. Reconsolidating memory. Effortful recall of learning, as happens in spaced practice, requires that you reload or reconstruct the components of the skill or material anew from long-term memory rather than mindlessly repeating them from short-term memory. 10. During this focused, effortful recall, the learning is made pliable again, the most salient aspects of it become clearer, and the consequent reconsolidation helps to reinforce meaning, strengthen connections to prior knowledge, bolster the cues and retrieval routes for recalling it later, and weaken competing routes. Spaced practice, which allows some forgetting to occur between sessions, strengthens both the learning and the cues and routes for fast retrieval when that learning is needed again, as when the pitcher tries to surprise a batter with a curveball after pitching several fastballs. The more effort that is required to recall a memory or to execute a skill, provided that the effort succeeds, the more the act of recalling or executing benefits the learning. 11. Mass practice gives us the warm sensation of mastery because we're looping information through short-term memory without having to reconstruct the learning from long-term memory. But just as with rereading as a study strategy, the fluency gained through massed practice is transitory, and our sense of mastery is illusory. It's the effortful process of embrace difficulties. 83. Reconstructing the knowledge that triggers reconsolidation and deeper learning. Creating mental models. With enough effortful practice, a complex set of interrelated ideas or a sequence of motor skills fuse into a meaningful whole, forming a mental model somewhat akin to a brain app. Learning to drive a car involves a host of simultaneous actions that require all of our powers of concentration and dexterity while we are learning them. But over time, these combinations of cognition and motor skills, for example, the perceptions and maneuvers required to parallel park or manipulate a stick shift, become ingrained as sets of mental models associated with driving. Mental models are forms of deeply entrenched and highly efficient skills or knowledge structures that, like habits, can be adapted and applied in varied circumstances. Expert performance is built through thousands of hours of practice in your area of expertise, in varying conditions, through which you accumulate a vast library of such mental models that enables you to correctly discern a given situation and instantaneously select and execute the correct response. Broadening mastery. Retrieval practice that you perform at different times and in different contexts, and that interleaves different learning material has the benefit of linking new associations to the material. This process builds interconnected networks of knowledge that bolster and support mastery of your field. It also multiplies the cues for retrieving the knowledge, increasing the versatility with which you can later apply it. Make it stick. 84. Think of an experienced chef who has internalized the complex knowledge of how flavors and textures interact, how ingredients change form under heat, the differing effects to be achieved with a saucepan versus a wok, with copper versus cast iron. Think of the fly fisher who can sense the presence of trout and accurately judge the likely species, make the right choice of dry fly, nymph, or streamer, judge the wind, and know how and where to drop that fly to make the trout rise. Think of the kid on the BMX bike who can perform bunny hops, tail whips, 180 seconds, and wall taps off the features of an unfamiliar streetscape. Interleaving and variation mix up the contexts of practice and the other skills and knowledge with which the new material is associated. This makes our mental models more versatile, enabling us to apply our learning to a broader range of situations. Fostering conceptual learning. How do humans learn concepts, for example the difference between dogs and cats? By randomly coming across dissimilar examples: Chihuahuas, tabby cats, Great Danes, picture book lions, calico cats, Welsh Terriers. Spaced and interleaved exposure characterizes most of humans' normal experience. It's a good way to learn, because this type of exposure strengthens the skills of discrimination, the process of noticing particulars, and of induction, surmising the general rule. Recall the interleaved study of birds in one case, and of paintings in another, that helped learners distinguish between bird types or the works of different painters, while at the same time learning to identify underlying commonalities of the examples within a species or an artist's body of work. When asked about their preferences and beliefs, the learners thought. Embrace difficulties. 85. That the experience of studying multiple examples of one species of bird before studying examples of another species resulted in better learning. But the interleaved strategy, which was more difficult and felt clunky, produced superior discrimination of differences between types, without hindering the ability to learn commonalities within a type. As was true for the baseball player's batting practice, interleaving produced difficulty in retrieving past examples of a particular species, which further solidified the learning of which birds are representative of a particular species. The difficulty produced by interleaving proved as a second type of boost to learning. Interleaved practice of related but dissimilar geometric solids requires that you notice similarities and differences in order to select the correct formula for computing the volume. It's thought that this heightened sensitivity to similarities and differences during interleaved practice leads to the encoding of more complex and nuanced representations of the study material, a better understanding of how specimens or types of problems are distinctive and why they call for a different interpretation or solution. Why a northern pike will strike a spoon or a crankbait, say, but a bass will happily powder his nose until you see fit to throw him a grub or a popper. 12. Improving versatility. The retrieval difficulties posed by spacing, interleaving, and variation are overcome by invoking the same mental processes that will be needed later in applying the learning in everyday settings. By mimicking the challenges of practical experience, these learning strategies conform to the admonition to practice like you play, and you'll play like you practice, improving what scientists call transfer of learning, which is make it stick. 86. The ability to apply what you've learned in new settings. In the Cal Poly batting practice experiment, the act of overcoming the difficulties posed by random types of pitches built a broader vocabulary of mental processes for discerning the nature of the challenge and selecting among possible responses than did the narrower mental processes sufficient for excelling during massed, non-varied experience. Recall the grade school students who proved more adept at tossing beanbags into 3-foot baskets after having practiced tossing into 2- and 4-foot baskets, compared to the students who only practiced tossing into 3-foot basket. Recall the increasing difficulty and complexity of the simulation training in jump school, or the cockpit simulator of Matt Brown's business jet. Priming the mind for learning. When you're asked to struggle with solving a problem before being shown how to solve it, the subsequent solution is better learned and more durably remembered. When you've bought your fishing boat and are attempting to attach an anchor line, you're far more likely to learn and remember the bowline knot than when you're standing in a city park being shown the bowline by a Boy Scout who thinks you would lead a richer life if you had a handful of knots in your repertoire. Other learning strategies that incorporate desirable difficulties. We usually think of interference as a detriment to learning, but certain kinds of interference can produce learning benefits, and the positive effects are sometimes surprising. Would you rather read an article that has normal type or type that's somewhat out of focus? almost surely you would opt for the embrace difficulties. 87. Former. Yet when text on a page is slightly out of focus or presented in a font that is a little difficult to decipher, people recall the content better. Should the outline of a lecture follow the precise flow of a chapter in a textbook, or is it better if the lecture mismatches the text in some ways? It turns out that when the outline of a lecture proceeds in a different order from the textbook passage, the effort to discern the main ideas and reconcile the discrepancy produces better recall of the content. In another surprise, when letters are omitted from words in a text, requiring the reader to supply them, reading is slowed, and retention improves. In all of these examples, the change from normal presentation introduces a difficulty, disruption of fluency, that makes the learner work harder to construct an interpretation that makes sense. The added effort increases comprehension and learning. 13. The act of trying to answer a question or attempting to solve a problem rather than being